Hey guys, so I know we're all looking forward to that ban list coming at the end of the month, but in the meantime, we do still have some regional level events to go through, post info. So as usual, I want to provide a tier list of the best meta and rogue decks in the current format post the European and North American WCQs, and there were some regional level events here and there as well, and also using a little bit of Dueling Book data as well. And as always, definitely go check out my discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles and sleeves below, and as usual, another shout out to YGOProduct.com as well as Ivan for keeping up with all of the meta relevant tops. Alright, so let's just get to the tier list for this month, and no surprise, we do have Fiendsmith Snake Eye coming out at top, by far surpassing every other deck. And so at the European North American WCQs combined, it essentially took up almost half of the top cut. Maybe one would argue they would have expected it to be higher, but nonetheless, half of the top cut from one deck is still absurdly high. And so, it's incredibly strong, and the Fiendsmith stuff, I think what's most annoying is the fact that they even have a win condition now in taunt because of the burn. It just makes it a little bit over the top now. So, you know what, I mean, there is a ban list coming at the end of the month. They're probably going to finally hit Snake Eye at this point because it's been tier 0 essentially for quite some time, essentially I guess around February. If you think about tier limit during tier 0 format, essentially they were tier 0 around November time when the Shizu stuff came out, and then February that ban list kind of essentially 3-month time frame like really hit it a lot, and we're at essentially like 6 months now for Snake Eye. Tenpai Dragon, they did have before info, of course, they did have that slightly disappointing showing at that whatever YCS it was, but you know what, it's bounced back pretty strong, and of course with the Genroku that came out of Infinite Forbidden, makes this deck much stronger, and it actually at the North American WCQ at least, it was actually undefeated in Swiss, first place Jonathan, who's Canadian actually, so really cool to see that. And the deck is obviously kind of stacky, really depends on whatever non-engine you draw, but really strong, and the field spell, not really liking the trend with those kind of uninteractable field spells, especially with like Gimmick Puppet, which we'll get to later, but again, and then you have Yubel. I think these three are the top 3 decks. I think that is pretty clear. This basically is like the Fiendsmith stuff, of course, just Yubel, there were already Fiends anyways, just gives them a nice little boost, and they've had some support from Battles of Legend as well with the Phantom Yubel, and now the Fiendsmith stuff, just making things a little bit more consistent, and had a decent amount of tops at the both WCQs as well. And then this one was a little bit surprising. This, kind of falls a lot farther down than the rest of these guys. But Ritual Beast, you know what? They actually did pretty well at the WCQ, right? Considering at least their expectation, I'm sure. I mean, something like Protos, I don't know why it came back. That's very strong. Dimension Shifter is very strong. They can also play Colossus, or they can even slap on Baguska. They have a lot of like floodgate kind of effects that they can access, and not to mention their in archetype like pops and everything as well. Then they also take like 20 minutes to combo. So you know what, it's quite the interesting deck, and I think maybe caught people by surprise as well. And moving on to tier 2, unfortunately we are still seeing stun decks do really well at the North American WCQ. Myself personally, I actually played against 3 stun decks in a row. I somehow managed to win all 3, but you know what, it is pretty scary, and it's just not fun to play against. But in a format where you have something like Snake Eye dominating, if you have a very cheap way to still compete in the meta, I mean, that stun is going to be your way to go. Shout out to Asian Persuasion, by the way. I feel like he always does super well with stun, and he did very well at the NAWCQ as well. So next we have Gimmick Puppet FTK. Now we've been dealing with the Gimmick Puppet lock for the last year and a half now with branded Despia, and now there's an actual Gimmick Puppet FTK deck rolling around into the current meta. Ironically enough, I don't think Gimmick Puppet Nightmare is actually played in this deck, or if it is, I'm sure it's not actually that very good in this deck. But you know what, super consistent FTK. If it gets to go first, you don't draw any hand traps, you're going to lose, right? And that's not very fun to have. But I know some people will argue, well, what's the difference with setting up like a bazillion negates or whatever. So yeah, you know what, arguable, but it is definitely something to consider. And I think with like Bestials rolling around pretty popular right now, I think that does at least hamper Gimmick Puppet a little bit at the very least. And then you have, speaking of branded Despia, this did not have as much success at the WCQs as maybe some people would have thought. Of course, my good friend Murat was the only branded player to top at the NAWCQ. He finished top 16, super impressive. Gimmick Puppet lock is, of course, very strong. Maybe not as strong as a Gimmick Puppet FTK, but you know what, branded Despia, even if it doesn't Gimmick lock, it still has a lot of different interruptions and ways to play. So I think it's really solid, but at the same time, you are in a very high hand trap format right now, which branded tends to struggle in those kind of formats. So next we have Memento, which I think is really cool. Obviously, kind of like a collection of your old school Yu-Gi-Oh monsters with retrained effects. So quite nostalgic. I know they do like a lot of pops and everything. And on top of that, I was actually looking at some of the topping lists, both at WCQ level, regional level, and only half of them were actually playing that Cranium Burst trap card, which sort of serves as a like multiple monster negates for you, I guess. So if you do play the deck, let me know, what your thoughts are on that card. I thought it was like a standard thing, but I guess not. But I'm really excited to learn more about this deck as I sort of continue to explore into this info format. And then you have Labrynth with like the Fiendsmith stuff. If they do play it, they don't always play it. I think you can still play at a competitive level without the Fiendsmith stuff, but you know what? It does provide a kind of more unique avenue. It becomes like pretty combo heavy from what I understand as well. And you can also go check out that deck profile by my friend Tian, who topped Niagara Regionals with Fiendsmith Labrynth. So you know what? It's still there, and you do have something like Transaction Rollback that you can dump off with the rank 6 access, and also something like, I mean, there's so many different traps you can access as well. So I think it's actually pretty solid. So next we have White Forest, which had more success in the European WCQ compared to the North American one, but you know what, there's still some potential. It's typically, I believe, played with like the runic stuff. I'm actually doing a survey on this deck right now, and I'll have that results pretty soon in terms of the key strengths and weaknesses of White Forest, at least in terms of the deck list at top. I know they were playing like Skill Drain, for example, because you know what, this deck, especially with like runic stuff, it goes well because you are like pitching spells or traps, and if you have Fuel Dot in the grave, it's kind of nice to be able to draw multiple as well. And even with like Skill Drain, because you can also send spell traps from the field, and you can always sort of add back that trap back, it's kind of nice to have. And then moving on to the Rogue tier, we have Rescue Ace, which is of course kind of weird to see, right? I mean, the last couple of months, it's definitely really declined in terms of meta representation. I mean, I still think purely in terms of high level, this deck is actually quite good. It's just that if you're playing anything with like a wanted engine, you're probably just playing Snake Eye anyways, right? So nonetheless, having a combination of back row interruption as well as monster interruption, I always find can be pretty hard to side against, but I think it is still pretty solid. And then you have Magical Muskets combined with the Fiendsmith stuff. Of course, Dinkabui topped with this. I think that's really cool. I believe Cam Neal also topped, or rather did really well with the World Playoff with Magical Muskets. You know what? I haven't really seen this deck play since about 2019. I want to say it was actually a going second deck at the time. I could be remembering that wrong, but I believe the ones at top were going first variant, because you know what? I think the Fiendsmith stuff, or rather, sorry, the Magical Musket stuff, just being able to play spells and traps from your hand when you control Magical Muskets, it can be pretty nice because they do have access to like a pop, some quick effect DD Crows, as well as even a counter trap that you can play from hand if you have a Magical Musket. So I really am excited for this deck as well to see what kind of damage it's going to do in the meta. Next you have Tearlaments, which I assume can be pretty strong with like Fiendsmith stuff, but the one that top actually did not play Fiendsmith stuff. It's the one at North American WCQ. He was actually playing like a bit more like Shadal package as well, so I think that's pretty interesting. I can only assume it's maybe not the best time for Tearlaments, just because people are kind of starting to play a lot more Bestials again, it seems like. Droll can also kind of hamper this deck as well, and of course Droll, especially in like a main deck, has also been pretty popular because of the rise of Fiendsmith's cards. So next you have Pearly. I think this has been kind of in like the rogue tier wise for quite some time. I mean, even though it did get some cards back on the ban list, really not seeing that much representation in terms of building up towers. I guess it's kind of nice against something like Tenpai. I know they can at least set up a couple towers actually, but other than that, I think maybe it's not really the best time for them. So next you have Mimighoul, which is super cool. It's one of the newer archetypes that came out of Infinite Forbidden. I believe I heard it's more so based on kind of like a board game, but I think it's cool because you get to like special summon your monsters to your opponent's field, and then as you flip them, they kind of like do some damage to your opponent and then comes back to you. So the one that topped, it was a regional level event. It was Mimighoul Kashira. I don't exactly know how that version works, at least the replays that I've been watching online. It was more so like the hand loop kind of variant, which of course hand loops are never fun, but at the same time I do think that it's a pretty unique gimmick for this deck. So speaking of Kashira, we have that next. It actually did not have any tops at the WCQ level, at the North American and European level events, which maybe is a little bit surprising because it is a shifter based deck and you would have thought maybe one could sneak in, but I guess it didn't. But I'm sure on another day maybe it perhaps could have. It did top regional level event though, and you know what, it is pretty solid. It's very consistent, going first and second. It can be pretty solid as well, especially with something like Fenrir. So you know what, cannot sleep on this deck for now. So next we have Vanquish Soul, which actually did top a WCQ level event, so that's kind of nice. But at the same time, I should also clarify, for the tier list for this month, because we don't have as many events to go with, because we only had really a couple of weekends worth of events post Infinite Forbidden, the scores can be a little volatile too, right? Especially when, certain decks will top, but as you give it a couple more months, maybe they'll start declining in terms of representation. Nothing to take away from Vanquish Soul, of course, you know what, very well deserved, especially with the playmat actually kind of fitting too, right? Because it was the Vanquish Soul mat, another shifter based deck. It's got ability to like pop stuff and everything, and being able to dodge targeting negation, which is pretty popular right now, like Imperm Veiler, Ghostborn, or things like that. So I think it's actually pretty fun. Next you have Salamangreat. I think if you give this a little bit more time in this format, of course prior to the ban list, I think it'll rack up some more tops at the regional level because it was doing quite well leading up until info format, as well as even the format before that, because generic fire support has been abundant lately in this year with Promethean Princes, and they also can make use of Raging Phoenix much better than any other deck, of course, and just having access to counter trap, trap that can just pop cards as well, really strong, very good grind game, ability to OTK quite easily as well, and also space to play hand traps, not to mention be able to also play something like Rivalry, really strong in this format. And then you also have Mannadium, which did have a regional level top. Obviously, this has really fallen off the cliff the last couple of months. And you know what? In a way, it's a little bit surprising too, because Droll is actually quite popular again, which it hasn't been in the last month or so at the very least. But at least, especially right as info started, you know, just as a precaution, I'm sure a lot of people were playing Droll because of the Fiendsmith stuff, which we did see at least the North American WCQ breakdown that I did. But nonetheless, I know, pretty impressive that Mannadium as a synchro strategy. I didn't actually look at the topping list for this one, but lately I was noticing they were playing some like Centurion stuff as well, and like, you know, Calamity locking and everything. I'm not exactly sure if this list did that, but that is an option out there. And lastly, Voiceless Voice. I want to include this because it really dropped off a cliff in the last few weeks for sure, and now just absolutely no tops at the WCQ level, no tops at the regional level so far, albeit we've only had a small number of regionals since Infinite Forbidden started. But you know what, I don't know if it's a combination of just like Droll being played a lot, as I mentioned earlier, Bistio is being played a lot as well, and you know, Voiceless Voice can get kind of cooked by that as well, and perhaps there are other reasons. If you do play this deck, definitely let me know what your thoughts are on this deck for the current format. Alright guys, so that was it for the tier list for this month. I understand that we are all looking forward to that August ban list, and things will just probably, hopefully, change a lot. But in the meantime, hopefully this was still helpful in terms of helping you kind of map out and plan out your events in the upcoming next couple weeks. So anyways, huge thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons and sponsors as always, and well, take care guys.